It's just unpredictable. But it's good to be here with all of you. And this week we're in the middle of Passover. And so our Torah portion is in relation to the holiday, but rather than focusing on the Torah portion of Passover, I decided to do something that relates to our Jewish calendar. Starting on the second night of Passover, we do something called the counting of the Omer. And it's a process of counting up to the holiday of Shavuot, where we receive the Torah on Mount Sinai from God. And so this 7-week period that we are now in the midst of is a period of reflection, a period of self-rejuvenation, a period of doing whatever we need to prepare ourselves for this really significant holiday within our tradition of receiving the commitments, receiving the commandments, receiving all that has been bestowed upon us through our Torah. So we're going to be focusing on, well, we'll talk about it a little bit, but basically on the soul trait of chesed, of loving kindness. And I'll talk a little bit more about why that is our focal point in a little bit. But right now, let us just say our blessing for studying Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam Asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah hafok ba la'asok b'divrei Torah yadadai Okay, so this is our Omer week 1. And Pam, I see you joined us. Welcome. So nice to have you here. We're going to be focusing on this idea of chesed, of loving kindness. And in Psalms 89, there is this quote. You might have a melody to a song going through your head as you read it, which is the world will be built by chesed. Olam chesed yibaneh. If you remember that song, so beautifully written by Menachem Creditor, it's based on this verse of Psalms. And so chesed is kind of foundational. Throughout the Omer, this 7-week period that we talked about, each week is focused on a different aspect of self. And there are 7 particular aspects. One, we'll go through what all of those are a little bit later. But this first week is all about chesed, loving kindness. And part of the reason that we start with chesed is because of what it says in Psalms right here, that the world is built by chesed. The world is built by love. Is this big enough for everyone? Can you all see it?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay, just making sure. So one of the things that I wanted to start with is, remember how we talked about this is all, the Omer period is all about leading up to Shavuot. One of the things we read on Shavuot, in addition to the 10 Commandments, is the story of Ruth. And so this story of Ruth is really this important tale. And within the book of Ruth, there's one word that is used like 30-something times. And that word is chesed. And so I want to just take apart a couple of different pieces here from the book, only 2 different verses, and then a commentary based upon them. We remember the story of Ruth is about a woman named Naomi. And Naomi had 2 sons and 2 daughters-in-law. Now, Naomi's husband got very ill and died. In addition to that, Naomi's 2 sons also became ill and also died. And so all 3 of the men in the family died. Naomi's two children did not have a chance to have children before they died. And so the daughters-in-law didn't have husbands and also didn't have children.
Oh, boy.
And Naomi turns to Ruth and Orpah, the other daughter-in-law, and says, go marry someone else. I can't give you another person. I don't have a son for you to marry, because that was the way that things worked at that time, was if your husband died, you would marry a sibling. I don't have any other children to give you. So please go back to your people, go and find someone that you can marry and start a life with, so your life doesn't have to be hard as mine is. And Orpah eventually said, with a little bit of coaxing, said, okay, I'm going to go marry someone else. I'm going to go. I love you. Bye. Good luck. But Ruth replied with this verse: do not urge me to leave you, to turn back and not follow you. For wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Ruth essentially said, I'm going nowhere. I'm not going to leave you alone. You're my family, and I'm going to go with you, and I'm going to stay in the family, and hopefully I'll find someone with whom to have children and to marry, but I'm not leaving you alone. A little bit later, 2 chapters later, we have this part of the story with Boaz. So what happens is Ruth and Naomi go on this long, long journey to go back to Naomi's homeland. And there is a man named Boaz. Now, Boaz is a distant relative of Naomi, and as a distant relative, he can be a redeeming kinsman, which means he can have children with Ruth in order to continue their family's line, which is what was done in those times. So Boaz, this is before that piece, but Boaz comes to Ruth and says this to her: blessed be you of Adonai, my daughter. You have shown more kindness in the end than at the beginning, inasmuch as you did not follow the young men, whether poor or rich. It's pointing out the kindness that she demonstrates in all of her actions throughout the story of Ruth. We're not going into all of them. There's quite a lot. And then Ruth Rabbi, which is Talmud based on the story of Ruth, quotes this first verse, or quotes an earlier verse from Ruth: God will deal kindly with you. And Rabbi Zera says in response to that, the scroll does not have anything in it concerned with impurity or purity, nor what is forbidden and what is permitted. Throughout the entire book of Ruth, there's no talk of any of those things. So why is it written? Why do we study the book of Ruth? To teach us that the greatest of the reward for acts of loving kindness. So according to this, the entire reason we study the book of Ruth is so that we can understand how powerful chesed truly is. So it kind of makes sense that we're starting this Omer process with the trait of chesed, because in some ways that's also where we're headed. We're starting and we're ending in the same place with this idea of loving kindness, this idea of compassion. So any comments or questions on that small piece of Ruth? Okay, if you do, you're more than welcome to unmute and to speak up. But then let's just start with this overall question. Why is chesed so important? We're starting with chesed. The whole book of Ruth is all about chesed. Why is it so important that we focus on chesed at all? There's no wrong answers.
I always think of chesed as incredible compassion. It's what some people say it's incredible love. It connects us with everyone else. It just is a whole different way of establishing community, of establishing relationships. I find in my teaching to mixed groups, they really resonate with the word chesed. They're not familiar with it. Once they hear it, and once they start discussing it, they realize that it's the key to everything in life is chesed. If you can say that word, it stirs the imagination.
So I hear connection, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Community coming together.
Yes.
And compassion. That's beautiful. Anything else anyone wants to add?
You know, for me, it's the aspect of humanity that is lacking in so many different ways with the rise of anti-Semitism. You know, in our country, 400 million guns, with shootings, with the war, and I mean, in Ukraine, everything that it's. I wish the world thought about Hesed more often in our lives, in the way we deal with one another. It's something that the world needs more of.
So if the world had more chesed, how would those things change? It's a very big question, and it's not just for you, Michael.
Yeah, right. I mean, we would intentionally be more kind, first to ourselves and for whatever shortcomings we have, but we would also be kind to others, those we know and live with, and strangers. And so why does there need to be all these shootings and wars and so on? For what? It's very sad.
It seems to me, actually, that if you ask the question about in the shooting or in Putin starting this war, somebody is thinking more about their own needs or desires than the needs and desires of others. Yeah, and maybe that's the whole key to it, that if you think more of the needs of others, well, you may not pull the trigger for whatever satisfaction you think that might give you. And the same goes for this ridiculous situation of massacre that's occurring in Ukraine, where one demented man sitting in Moscow wants power. He wants, for some reason, it doesn't matter what all these other people need and the fact that they're being even deprived of life. He has something in his mind, and that dominates it rather than thinking about others and their needs.
Yeah. Thanks, Jim. And I think that goes back to what Larry was saying too, right? About connection. Yeah, sorry, who was trying to speak?
Marla, I was just thinking, I don't think it has to be an either or choice. I'd like to think that people could incorporate the notion of chesed every day in every aspect of their life, all the while understanding that people do come from an I position of what's in it for me, how do I take care of myself, what's better than. And yet I think to temper it with incorporating chesed in one's life, each of us would be a better person, hence a better world. I don't know why that doesn't happen. I'm trying to think, when do children change from being self-centered, egocentric? They start out that way, right? They get up and that's why the sun rises in their mind's eye, that they're entitled. And then we teach them, they learn about helping others and they learn it socially. And then something happens later on in life where the things that, like Michael's talking about, adults by age, I'm not talking maturity, but adults by age make these terrible choices. And like Jim is saying, these really bad choices. And that chesed goes out the window and it goes back to being self-centered, egocentric, etc. And maybe that's the place for a spiritual life, that maybe we're the purpose of synagogues and churches and mosques. Maybe that's why we have those things, to bring us back to that.
I think that's a big part of it, Marlo. There's so much in what you said that is really, really helpful, I think, right? The idea that, yes, chesed is a wonderful thing, but it can also get out of control, right? That everything needs balance in our midot. But also, how do you figure out if your balance is off? How do you figure out if you're too much in the I category or too much in the you category? Because it can be very, very easy for us to lose balance in that arena in one way or the other. Either we're not taking care of ourselves as well as we need to be, or we're not thinking of other people's needs as much as we need to be. So, and we're going to get back to some of those ideas in a little bit. So thank you so much. Does anyone else have something they wanted to say about that before we move on?
It's all about.
Yeah, go ahead, Michael.
I mean, I've said it before. I mean, it's all about ego in my mind, and how we place our lives and our wants above those of others, and it just gets out of hand, and selfishness and whatever, rather than being kind to one another. That's, and trying to help another person or another country or whatever it is.
Yeah.
I find it hard to believe we could ever get out of balance. I know we could, but I think the whole world needs more chesed. I know I need more chesed. I know the people around me need more chesed. There's just not enough.
So Larry, let's get back to that in a little bit, okay?
Sure.
Because I think that there might be some comments about that, but I have some text I want to bring in to speak to that. So let's hold off for just a second, but it's a really, really good part of conversation. I brought in a couple of different texts that really talk about why chesed is so important. And one of these texts comes from Avot de Rabbi Natan. This is a midrashic text. And he writes, how do we know the significance of acts of chesed? As the prophet Hosea said, for I desire acts of chesed and not sacrifice. The world began only with covenantal love. As it said in Psalms, the world was built on chesed, right? Olam chesed yibanet, that we read at the very beginning. One time it happened that Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, say that a few times fast, was leaving Jerusalem, and Rabbi Joshua was walking after him. He saw the ruins of Solomon's temple. Rabbi Joshua said, what a devastation for us that the place where Israel atoned for our sins has been destroyed. Rabbi Yochanan replied, my son, do not fear. We have another form of atonement that is just as effective. What is it? Acts of chesed. This is what the verse from Hosea means when it says, for I desire acts of chesed and not sacrifice. So what do you make of this text? What do you get from it? Or do you have questions about it?
It's moving forward rather than concern about the past, moving forward in a positive, meaningful direction. Acts of Hesed.
Yeah, I mean, that's beautiful, right? There are so many things in our tradition that are really important rituals. But if we focus too much on the ritual and not enough on the humanity, the meaning behind it, right? Then we're kind of missing the point. There was, I forget who the rabbi was many years ago, but it was in the middle of High Holy Day services on Yom Kippur. And this little 2-year-old started running around the temple and just acting, like an excited 2-year-old. And the rabbi picked up the little child who was making all these noises, and everyone in the congregation is smiling and looking at this little child. And the rabbi turned to the congregation and said, we forgive this young 2-year-old for running around and making arachas during services. At what age do we lose compassion and stop forgiving? And it's really powerful, right? Like the rites have meaning, but if we don't also have the chesed, if that's not our focus, well, that's a problem, isn't it? It goes back to what Marla said, right? Perhaps this is the reason, or one of the most important reasons, that we need synagogue, so that we can actually push ourselves forward to really think this through and to make sure that we're not just doing things that truly aren't in line with our values. Yeah, Tom, please.
No, I was just going to say, this is also the time where we're going from temple sacrifice to rabbinic Judaism, where
Yes.
we're replacing sacrifice as, and our acts as, in living Judaism, becomes it's more on us now at this point to live our lives in this way. And so I see it's us taking responsibility, at that time.
Yeah, beautiful. And we can continue to do that. Thank you. I want to bring in one other text that also is kind of uplifting chesed. And this comes from the Talmud as well, but it comes from the tractate Sukkah. The sages taught that acts of kindness are superior to acts of charity in 3 respects. Charity can be performed only with one's money, while acts of kindness can be performed both with his person and with his money. Charity is given to the poor, while acts of kindness are performed both for the poor and for the rich. Charity is given to the living, while acts of kindness are performed both for the living and for the dead. Do you agree with this? Any thoughts on it? Marla's nodding.
It just feels good to listen to those words somehow. I want so badly to have them resonate with me and how I'm living my life. It's a process. It just feels good to hear that.
Yeah, and it's a process for all of us, if we're honest, right? Yeah, Tom, did you want to say something?
Yeah, just further on that, I just, kind of continuing along, I see, that for me, I take away that it's not, it's intentionality of, what we're doing and how we're living our lives. It's more than just, going through the motions and tithing, giving certain amounts of money and that kind of thing. And it's also from the heart.
Yeah. How much more meaningful is it when we can truly give of our whole selves from the heart, right? And feel free, I can only see 4 people at a time. So please, if I don't see you, just jump in. I don't want to overlook anyone, but I just can't see everyone. Hi, Keith. I'm so glad you joined us today. It's good to see you. Oh, you're muted though, so I don't know if you're saying something, Keith. Keith, can you unmute if you want to say something, please?
Okay. Yep. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're good.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry I'm late. Can you back up for a second? I want to see what the
Sure.
sages said.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to see it. I did have a comment. So, I understand they say acts of kindness are superior to charity. What was the basis of that? Meaning, why would they even comment on that? What was the background on that, if there is any,
There might be a background that I'm not aware of, but I think that rabbis like to kind of see what is the most important. There's a lot of disagreement among the rabbis on just about everything, right?
Exactly.
But
yeah.
In this case, it's trying to really uplift this characteristic of chesed. That yeah, charity is a good thing, giving tzedakah is a good thing, but it's even better to just act and live your life in accordance with chesed.
Oh, okay. And the Sukkah 49b, is that from the Talmud?
Yes, this is Talmud. This is Talmud Bavli.
Okay. All right, thanks.
So I'm going to bring in one other quote, and this might be very, very familiar to a lot of you, right? From Pirkei Avot. Shimon the righteous was from the remnants of the Great Assembly. He would say, on 3 things the world stands: on Torah, on service, and on acts of chesed. Right? We say these words when we have the Torah out from the ark. Al ha-Torah, Bal ha-Avodah, Val gemilut chasadim, right?
Mm-hmm.
So just really kind of underlining the importance of all of that. Looking at the time, I'm going to move us ahead just a little bit unless there's a comment. So this is a text in Exodus that is really familiar, especially around the High Holy Days, but other times it comes up as well, of course, where God passed before Moses and proclaimed, Adonai, Adonai, God compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, Rav Chesed, of great loving kindness and faithfulness, extending kindness to the 1,000th generation, forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin. Yet she does not remit all punishment, but visits the iniquity of parents upon children and children's children upon the 3rd and 4th generations. So this is a name of God. Does anyone remember the context of this name of God and what happens in this text? I'm happy to give that backstory. So if we remember, this relates actually to the golden calf incident, where Moses came down the mountain, and what did Moses see? But all the Israelites had lost patience and they were worshiping the golden calf, and God was angry. And God said, I'm just going to destroy the people and give you a new people, Moses.
Yeah.
And Moses said, no, don't do that. Chas v'chalila. God forbid you do such a thing, right? That's not actually what he said there, but it's this kind of sentiment. And God ends up responding by saying, here is the name, here is my name that lists my virtues. It lists my highest values as God. And whenever I'm starting to lose my temper, whenever you want forgiveness, whenever you want to appeal to the part of me that is filled with chesed, I want you to say this name. And so on Yom Kippur, when we're asking for atonement, we say this name quite a lot. But essentially, God is asking to be reminded of God's chesed here, which is really, really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And based upon this text, there's a few more, if you'll notice, right? It says, as the Blessed Holy One is called Chassid, one filled with loving kindness, one filled with compassion, you should be Chassid. You should also have that trait, work to have that trait. God is working towards it, and you're working toward it as well. So any comments or thoughts on that? Because I know the wording of how I said that, God is working toward chesed, might be, not necessarily in line with your personal theology.
And chesed, I missed kind of what's chesed? What's the translation of chesed?
There's a lot of different translations. It sometimes is compassion. It could be loving kindness.
Well, for me, because I think we are all in the image of God. The notion of this being something, a work in progress, whether it's God or us people, that how nice it is for me to think that because I might not be 100%, if you will, my vocabulary is not, or my syntax is not necessarily correct, but I'm not 100% hesed, if you will. The idea that I can be working on it, that I can continue to approach it, is really very empowering. It's very nice to know. And it's validating to think that I'm okay with thinking God isn't perfect. Now, that certainly may be different from some people's ideology and theology, but I'm okay with that because the notion that God's working towards chesed appeals to me. It's like a cool partner. We're both working towards it.
Beautiful. Thank you, Marla. Tom, did you want to say something? And then Michael.
Yeah, for me, along with Marla, I kind of take, this is our model to follow, to aspire to that level. On the theology side, it depends where you're coming from, is traditional kind of God as a separate entity, or panentheism, or, God is everything, and, all of that, that I'm on a little bit different page on that part, but it's what Marla was saying. I think that's a great model for us to aspire to.
I just wanted to say, I like what Marla said, and I agree with that. I used to have to think that God was the essence of perfection, but we see that God is not totally perfect, and that certainly neither are we, and we're both working towards that goal. Which seems elusive at times, but still.
Yeah. Marley, you have a fan club.
I think there is a book called The Evolution of God.
I think you're thinking of God, a History, where
Possibly.
it goes through. So there's a book, I have it on my bookshelf behind me. There's a book that goes through the history of God throughout time using the Bible to describe God's evolution throughout the Torah and so on, that God is working on becoming better, working towards these aspirational goals.
And we're working together to do it.
Yeah. I can get that title to everyone if you'd like a little bit later, but thanks, Larry. Am I missing anyone? Again, I can only see a few people at once. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what chesed actually is. And Rabbi Abraham Yachmis wrote this short piece that I thought was really, really interesting, and I'm curious if you'll agree with it or not.
Yeah.
But he said, if you are walking down the street and someone is walking beside you, oh, sorry, it shouldn't have said carrying twice. I made a mistake there. Someone is walking beside you carrying a large box, and you offer to help the person carry the box. That's not chesed. You'd simply be a terrible person not to help someone in that situation. What counts as chesed is when you're walking the opposite way from someone carrying a burden, and you turn around to help carry the load in the direction that he or she is going. That's chesed. So what do you think of that?
Well, I don't necessarily think that if you're walking in the same direction and you offer help to somebody, that you're a terrible person. I don't agree with that.
Right.
You know, I mean, that's showing compassion and helping somebody. I'm not sure what Rabbi Yachmis there is.
Actually,
What's his
what he
point?
meant was that if you didn't help the person carry the package in the same direction, you'd be a terrible person. That
Right.
it would be most reasonable for you to just help them since you're both going in the same direction.
Yeah, okay. That's a good
But
point.
even still, it's a little harsh, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so.
But like, what is the point that he's trying to make here?
Is going out of your way to help another person, walking in the opposite direction from which you're walking. I chuckled when I saw this because I don't know if I've ever done anything. I don't think I've ever done anything like this, but it certainly is a goal to try to achieve if it ever would happen in my life.
I think I would like to think that there's different degrees and levels of hesed, just like in love and other relationships, that it's not just black or white type of hesed.
Yeah, that's a good point, right? And this one example, it's written in a vacuum. We don't know all the other circumstances around it. There could be lots of other reasons why, you know, even someone's walking in the same direction of you and you can't help them. There could be a million reasons why you would choose not to do that are legitimate reasons, right? So I totally get that his wording is a little bit harsh and certainly more brash than I would use here.
My question on this is just, who's he talking to? You know, what's the mentality of these people that he feels like he has to get this granular and, you know, kind of, I don't know.
That's a good question too. Or is it just an opportunity to, you know, get people motivated to join a conversation around this?
That's what my sense is. I think I remember us studying this this rabbi's statement, this writing, you know, years and years ago in Torah study, and I remember that I had a sense that kind of almost a visceral response to it. It does promote thoughtfulness and discussion, and reflection, and like Tom said, intentionality or motivation, and the why, and the purpose. So I think it's I'm sort of glad for this rabbi's statement and the way he framed it, because it just simply for me opened the door.
Yeah, sometimes it's a little bit provocative, and sometimes that pushes us, right? But I think the ultimate meaning behind it is that we have responsibilities to one another. Doing something that is absolutely a responsibility isn't chesed. Doing something above and beyond our responsibility is chesed. It's kind of like, actually, I'm not going to go there. That would open a whole other can of worms, and we only have so much time. But I just wonder if that piece of responsibility changes things, right? If someone is right next to us, it doesn't hurt us in order to keep the door open for someone or something like that. What he's saying is maybe that's not an act of chesed. That's just something that we should do, but going out of our way to be there for that person, really, truly out of our way, that is a higher degree of chesed.
Yeah, maybe this is just that, Hillel said, now go and study. Maybe this is one of those, okay, what does it mean to don't do unto others? And this is a kind of part of that.
Beautiful, exactly. I have a coffee mug with that quote on it. So let's go back to something that was brought up a little earlier today, which is the limitations of chesed. And this gets back to something that you were talking about, Marla, that so this might seem to be going in another direction, but I promise you it's not. I clicked something I shouldn't have clicked and got myself out of it. There we go. So going back to a few weeks ago, the Torah portion, we were talking about kashrut and how we know that an animal is kosher, right? And there's this one animal that is called a chasida. You can see the similarity between the word chesed and chasida. And a chasida is a stork. That's what we're talking about, a white stork. So in Chulin, this is also in the Talmud, and the chasida and the anafa after its kinds are non-kosher birds, Leviticus says. Rabbi Yehuda says, as for the chasida, this is the white stork. And why is it called chasida? Since it performs charity, hasidut, for its fellows, giving them from its own food. Okay, so the reason it's earned this name is because it generously gives its own food to its fellows. So then the rabbis ask, okay, if this stork, if we are what we eat, we don't eat animals that are predators, we don't eat animals that have traits that we wouldn't want to have, right? And this stork is kind and full of chesed, why isn't it kosher? Anyone have any thoughts about why it wouldn't be kosher?
Well, I would think that chesed, as I said before, is a desired trait throughout all humanity. Jewish or not Jewish, kosher or not kosher, that doesn't count. To be chesed is an incredibly desirable attribute for the whole world, independent of who they are, what background they are.
So you're coming from a much more modernist perspective there, Larry.
Yes.
Definitely from a much more open-minded place than the rabbis of this time, nearly 2,000 years ago were. But it's a really beautiful, it's not what the rabbis would say, but it is a really beautiful modern interpretation and understanding of this, that it's wider than the net of kosher, right? Yes. It's inclusive of everyone. That's beautiful. Yes. Any other ideas? Well, I can tell you what the rabbis say in response to this, okay? And the rabbis say that yes, the stork was kind. The stork had a lot of generosity for its fellows. But here's the thing, the text says for its fellows. It was kind, but only to other beings who looked like it,
Mm.
only to other storks, not to anyone or anything else. And true chesed is beyond that.
Right.
True chesed is being kind to all living things, not just to our own.
Right.
Any comments or thoughts on that, Sandy? I wasn't sure if you wanted to say something. No? Okay. You moved your hand. I thought you were unmuting.
Yeah.
So what does that have to do with being kosher or not kosher?
So kosher, from the perspective of rabbis, at this time especially, right? Kosher means the most desirable. If we're going to eat only animals, like we're not eating predators, we're not eating animals that act in any sort of a predatory kind of sense, and we are what we eat is kind of the idea underneath that, then wouldn't we want to be chesed? Wouldn't we want to take this on? And so if there's an animal called chasida, why wouldn't we eat it so that we can have a little bit more chesed? That's why the rabbis are focusing on that.
Is a stork a predator?
No, it's not.
Okay.
I'm just giving greater context
Sure.
to kashrut and where the rabbis' concerns were around that. Okay, a couple of more things in here. We're doing okay on time. This is a text from Deuteronomy. We're going to be getting to this in a few months from now. And our text says, if, however, there's a needy person among you, one of your kin in any of your settlements in the land that your God Adonai is giving you, do not harden your heart and shut your hand against your needy kin. Rather, you must open your hand and lend whatever is sufficient to meet the need. So when we look at this text, I want us to think about, like, what does that actually mean? To open our hand and lend whatever is sufficient to meet the need. Why does it use that wording, sufficient?
I'm a little bit confused on this with what you just mentioned with the stork. It will be kind in the sense of giving food to its own kind, but isn't this limited in the same way? If there's a needy person among you, one of your kin, isn't that similar to that?
Yes, it absolutely can be there. We look at the Hebrew words, right? The word is ach, which means brother or brethren. The rabbis will talk a lot about how we understand that term. Does it mean a familial connection? Is it broader than that? Can we understand it as in we're all brothers and sisters? At different times, different rabbis will have different interpretations. And we know a translation is only as good as the perspective of the person who makes it, right? So when it's saying needy kin, the word kin is kind of used in a very ambiguous way, depending on how we personally understand this. And as we read it, we also need to understand that this text was written thousands of years ago in a very different time where tribal mentality was very much the way of the world, right? And hopefully we've progressed since then. Sometimes I wonder a little bit how much we've progressed since then, but hopefully we've progressed since then so that we can question this and say, hey, this actually isn't okay. It should be a lot broader, just like the storks.
If you look what's happening in Poland with the refugees from Ukraine and the number of people who have opened their homes to total and complete strangers and offering them, shelter and in their own homes, boy, that's pretty high up there on this chesed.
It absolutely is. And as we're talking about that, right? I mean, if we look at Poland, for example, whose population is what, like that of Los Angeles County, the amount of people that they have taken in, the amount of responsibility that they've taken on and caring for people who have lived through incredible trauma and are continuing to live through incredible trauma. Is there a limit to chesed? Is there a time where it actually becomes too much and not helpful?
I was just going to say about the limit of Hesed, the last sentence, and there's one word in here that says, rather you must open your hand and lend whatever is sufficient to meet the need.
Mhm.
But at a certain point, if it's financial, for example, rather than something you do with your hands or mind, if you actually, in order to meet the need, if you give too much to meet the need, you might be putting yourself or your family in a position of need yourselves down the road.
Right.
So that's as to what you're saying about the limitations of chesed within this context.
Right. And that doesn't necessarily mean the answer is to turn away and say, I don't care about your plight. Right.
Right.
It could be reaching out to others and saying, this is how much I can give toward the need that are greater than I can handle. I need your help in order to fill the rest of the need, because the need needs to be filled.
Yes.
Right. It's like going back to the Rabbi Tarfon quote, that it's not up to you to complete the task, but neither are you free to just turn away from it. Right.
Right.
Any other thoughts or comments on this?
This section only applies to our kinsmen. It doesn't apply to other strangers in the land that we went into, right?
At this time, yes. But the hope is that now, when we look at this, we can be far more broad-minded than that.
What's the consequence if you don't do this?
There's overall societal consequences. I don't recall anything written like a personal consequence. Right? But I mean, if we as a society repeatedly turn away and don't respond when people who are in need are asking for help, we become like Sodom and Gomorrah. We don't want that.
I think there's also a balance too that's very tricky, because if you give too much and keep giving, in a way you are enabling the person not to do for themselves. So that's when it becomes too much.
So it's not only trying to balance out chesed so that we're not overgiving, but it's also being thoughtful about the ways in which we give, so that we're enabling people to do self-care, to have the dignity to be able to gain their own skills and their own footing. Really, really important. Thank you for bringing that in too.
I also think, for me, this is simply a starting point in terms of how and why we really ought to open our hand. And then there are further steps that we can take. But this, and the first of which is to remember not to, and it says here, not to harden your heart. And sometimes we do that to ourselves because we want to protect ourselves from the, social or political environment. So this is a starting point, and to begin to fill the need, not to be responsible to totally fill it, because we'd like everybody to participate. Everybody get a chance to achieve chesed, and in any different way, not all the same way.
That's beautiful. What you're saying, Marla, reminds me of a text that I almost put in here, but I realized I had way too much text to begin with, which was a text about Abraham that talked about how when Abraham woke up in the morning, this was a Musar text. I would have to think for a second about exactly where it came from, but when Abraham woke up in the morning, he woke up with chesed on his heart, so that when he was approaching people and approaching things throughout the day, he would do so with a kind of generosity, self-generosity, as well as generosity for others, a generosity of spirit that would enable him to see everything in the world through the eyes of chesed, through the eyes of compassion. And that was really interesting.
I think this quote from Philo is right on.
Yeah, this quote from Philo is one of my favorites, right?
Mhm.
Be kind, for everyone you meet is fighting a great battle. Yeah, go ahead, Keith.
No, that was it. I was
Yeah,
just saying.
I was just going to say, I saw that from Robin Williams, and I remember thinking, wow, that's so profound, and right on. And then I just saw in your thing, it's from a few thousand years ago, and it's pretty much the same thing. It's pretty interesting.
But isn't that so true, right? It's like all throughout this pandemic, it's like I need compassion because I'm going through a lot. And the idea is, yeah, every single one of us needs compassion because we're all going through a lot. All of us are fighting great battles and we don't know what's going on in one another's lives and one another's minds and hearts. So let's approach one another with the compassion that we would if we did know. I have one more text here from Alan Marinis because I don't like doing Musar without Alan Marinis's voice. And then I have a prayer written by Alden Salavi at the very, oh, I forgot I have the Sephiroth stuff. Oh, I have all sorts of stuff. Okay, we'll see how much we get through. So Alan Marinis wrote this. Actually, this came from the Musar Institute teaching. It came this morning. It was sent out. If you would like to get the Omer kind of teachings they're sending out each day, if you look on the Musar Institute's website, you could sign up for that. They're really great. But today's felt just right on, so I brought it in here. And he wrote, the Torah says a confounding thing when it refers to brother-sister incest is chesed. So there's a whole other text that I'm not going into right now, but there seems to be something where it's referring to that as chesed. In Guide for the Perplexed, Rambam addresses what it means, especially in light of the more common use of the word chesed to refer to loving kindness. We have explained the expression chesed as denoting an excess, emphasis added. It is especially used of extraordinary kindness. Loving kindness is performed in two ways. First, we show kindness to those who have no claim whatsoever upon us. Secondly, we're kind to those to whom it is due in greater measure than is due to them. From the Rambam, we learn two different lessons. One is the root notion of chesed is excess. The Torah may be saying that brother-sister relations are over the top. I hope it is, right? That excess is evaluated negatively. We get a corroboration with this idea right in the early blessings of the Amidah in our prayer service, which is the core of the Jewish prayer service. In the second blessing, we praise God as one who does good acts of kindness. Baruch Gomel Chasidim Tovim. If acts of kindness are by definition in and of themselves good, why put the word good in front of these words? Isn't the word good redundant? No, it isn't, because the essence of chesed is excess, and that can be excess for good or negative. Chesed can sometimes, even despite our best efforts, lead us to do things that are not actually in line with our values, that are not actually helpful. And so going back to what you were saying a little bit earlier, Sandy, right? It's not just about giving and being generous. It's also about evaluating, are we being generous and giving and loving in ways that are appropriate, in ways that will actually move us forward? So really good kind of questions to have in mind. I'm going to walk us through this whole thing with the Sephiroth really, really fast. So essentially, if we remember, the Sephiroth, I know this is a little small, the Sephiroth are 10 aspects of the semblance of God. Okay, so basically different aspects of God that are then reflected in us as human beings created in God's image. And they are related. The seven on the bottom are connected to the 7 weeks of the Omer. So this week, we're focused on chesed, loving kindness. Next week, we move over to gevurah, which has to do with judgment and power. And we know that chesed can go to excess. Chesed can be negative or it can be positive, depending on how it's used, right? Or how far on the scale we kind of go with it. Gevurah is a balance for chesed. And so the idea is by focusing on chesed this week, and Gevurah next week, perhaps we can find the right balance within ourselves. The week after, we move to Tiferet, which is beauty. It's a balance of Chesed and Gevurah and how that plays out in our lives. Then we move to Netzach, which is eternity. Then we move to Hod, which is splendor. Yesod, which has to do with foundations. And then Shekhinah, or Malchut, which is God's presence in our earthly realm. So every single week, we focus on a different aspect so that we can get ourselves fully ready to receive the commandments. And if you look over here at this other chart, I know it's all in Hebrew, but basically the way the Omer works, if you remember from the past, is when we started on the second night of the Seder, that was day 1. On that day, we focused on chesed within chesed. So not only are there 7 different Sephiroth that we're focused on, 7 different aspects of self, but each day we focus on the way that different Sephiroth, the way that different aspects interact with one another. So the first day, it was about chesed and chesed. The second day, it was about the interaction of chesed and gevurah. The next day about Tiferet, beauty with chesed, and so on. And so it's just kind of showing a chart of how that looks. And if you didn't understand all of that, that's totally okay. But it is a helpful visual if you want to take some time to look through all of that. Okay, so any other comments? I know I threw a lot at you, and especially that last piece, I didn't really have enough time to fully explain. But are there any other questions or comments that you want to bring in?
I have some.
Please.
All my life, I've been guided by the words of Micah, where he emphasizes 3 things. He says, do justice, very important. He says, love, loving kindness. And lastly, walk humbly with your Lord. So justice is a hallmark of Judaism. It's a hallmark of the Torah. And together with that, if you want to balance it, it's loving kindness. They go together. Justice without loving kindness is no justice. So when you're doing justice, think about the kindness, bend the justice. And when you do loving kindness to balance that, do some justice as well. There is.
So Larry, you're moving us into next week's Omer, because next week when we focus on Din, that has to actually do with justice as well. So you're kind of bringing the 2 together, and it's true that they balance each other out. So that's very appropriate.
Yes, I live by those words.
Mm-hmm.
Micah's words, 5:5.
Mm-hmm. So I wanna kind of close this out with words of prayer. And Eldon Salavi wrote this beautiful prayer poem called Let Love. And he wrote, let love wash over your face, caress your eyes, brush your lips. Let love pulse through your heart, warm your lungs, fill your chest. Let love strengthen your bones, ignite your nerves, awaken your flesh. For love is in the air and the wind, the current and the waters, the flow of gifts from God's creation, divine bounty and grace, calling out to you, dear sisters and brothers, awake you slumberers, awake you who walk warily into the day and dejected into the night. Have you forgotten my gifts and treasures? Have you forsaken the beauty around you? Have you surrendered your joy and passion? This then is God's command. Let love wash over you, pulse through you, pour strength into you. Let love carry you into luminous days and radiant nights. Sing and dance, laugh and play, lifting your life with passion and hope. Let love be your messenger and your message. Blessed are you, God of love. And I hope that as we go forward into this day after studying all about chesed, all about loving kindness, that we can give ourselves self-love of caring for ourselves, of taking care of ourselves, and also like Abraham, see the world through loving eyes so that we can look at one another with dignity and respect.
Thank you.
Thank
Rabbi.
you all so
Thank
much
you.
for being here and taking part in Torah study. I'm so grateful for every one of you. And next week, we're going to come right back together. Hopefully, we'll be able to do it as a hybrid. If there's a desire to make it hybrid, if people would prefer to be online, that's totally fine too. Today, because a few people within the temple are, recovering from COVID, it felt like it made more sense for us to do it online. But if you have a desire to come in person, let me know and maybe we'll make it a hybrid for next week.
Okay, good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank
And
you,
welcome,
Rabbi.
Keith. We're so happy
Good.
to have you here.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.